You're listening to the official podcast of the Westside Vineyard in Los Angeles, a community of individuals and families connecting with God to change the world.
You know what? I'm going to kind of, stop pursuing anything, kind of cut myself off from expectations or really thinking about my life and being a part of anything bigger. And we kind of withdraw to that internally or perhaps unconsciously we even do that. And we just, somewhere inside of us, we've stepped back. And the more that we face opposition in life or rejection in life, the more I think we tend to have a hard time wanting to stand up. We want to sit down. We have a hard time stepping out and moving forward like little Luke is going to start. Instead of stepping out, we want to step back in one fashion or another. And the call to faith is that faith to call us forward, to engage us to be those who press forward. And so we're going to continue in our series engaging faith as it's modeled to us as we learn from it, from the pioneers, if you will, some of the great lives of faith. In the book of Hebrews, it's really a tract or a treatise to those who were facing hard times and wanting to withdraw. And it's written to them and in the scriptures to speak to why they need to press on, press in, go forward, not pull back, not quit. And that's God's word for us today, is that. And we are all part of what God's doing. And so what He's done in the past, He's inviting us to join, to build upon what He's done in the past, to look at those lives of faith and to realize, wait, that's what I'm going to gain from. That's what I want to connect to as well. I like what Bernard Shard said this. He said, we are like dwarves today, seated on the shoulders of giants. We see more things than the ancients and things more distant. We got a bigger perspective. Things are even clear. But it's due neither to the sharpness of our sight nor the greatness of our stature. It is simply because they have lent us their own. The ancients lend to us their stature. They lend to us their insights. They invite us to walk in those ways. So when we ask, how does God want to work in our life? There are a few shoulders that are bigger to stand on than the life of Moses. And today we're going to engage that life and what Moses has to teach us. The book of Genesis provides 4 of the main lives are just in the book of Genesis of these lives of faith. Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Joseph, who we're going to look at next week. The rest of the Pentateuch takes up these books, the whole of the life of Moses, because there is so much there. He's the one who comes and is raised up as the leader to lead the people, as many of you are familiar with, out of oppression when the Israelites are in Egypt, and he leads them out of the parting of the Red Sea and then towards the Promised Land. It's the kind of role that is so great, so grand, we think only Charleston Heston can possibly play that role. And so it's like, do we ever even want to temper that? Because only a figure that big and looming, and yet, if you look more closely at the life of Moses, you'll find that he proves to be one who's actually the most human, that identifies in ways that deeply relates to us and the fragileness of life and the wounds of life. There is so much there. And so in Hebrews, the largest section is dedicated to say, look at his life, learn from his faith. And that's what we do. As you follow in Hebrews 11:23, we'll put on the screen, it's there in the insert in your bulletin. We read this where the writer says, it was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. And we'll unpack that for those less familiar with the story. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king, that is Pharaoh's command to kill the children. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, even though he was raised in the courts of Pharaoh. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger, the Pharaoh's anger for having left. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle the blood on the doorpost so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons when judgment was coming upon the land of Egypt. It was by faith that the people of Israel went right through the Red Sea as if they were on dry ground, but the Egyptians tried to follow and they were all drowned. And there is this summation of this dynamic life, and it's interesting that it's not really focused on saying it was by faith that Moses did great things. It's not really quite on those exploits. It's not really quite on the deeds. It's actually on the fact that he somehow persevered. He rose up against so much. It was by faith that he said no to this, and he kept going forward. He said, nope, I'm going to choose. And you see these powerful decisions that allowed him to keep going forward when he had so many reasons not to. So many things that it kind of could have oppressed his life, that caused him to withdraw, go to the sidelines. But somehow Moses kept coming back and moving forward through so much. And really the thing that is marked in his life is this faith to endure or to persevere. And that is what marked his life. That is what God wants to call us into ourselves, to endure, to move forward, to stand up. And this word endure that's being used here, it's the same one by which, the Apostle Paul would later write and say, I embrace the sufferings of suffering for Christ, and I am able to endure. It's the same word, and this word is hypomena in Greek, and it just simply, mena means to stand or to stay, and hypo is, as we use the word in English, hyper. So it means hyper-staying or hyper-standing. Do you want to be a hyper-stander? Sounds pretty good. I mean, we all like hyper-speed these days. Well, this is hyper-standing, the ability to stand powerfully against the flow that is coming at you. It's as if you and I were standing in a river, and no matter how hard the flow is that should set us back and we kind of get assailed by it, it's this ability to be so deeply rooted, to be so deeply determined that one is able to hyperstand, to become a powerful force within, to stand against the oppression and the rejection that life will bring, and it will bring it as we realize through his life. And the question that we do well to ask is, how do we become hyperstanders? How do we become people who are durable? Is it possible to become a person in an age where everything is shifting and I feel like I'm just trying to figure out who I am and hold on and there's nothing to hold on to because it's all relative? Is it possible to be a durable person? At a time when there's fragileness of relationships, fragileness of identity, fragileness in so much, is it possible to be so deeply rooted that I can continue to go forward, that I don't kind of get knocked off by setbacks, but I press on against everything that life has dealt me and might deal for me? And Moses, and the answer that God has for us is yes, the writer says. Yes, you can. When you look at the life of Moses, you can see it. It's the power of faith at work. But I want to introduce us quickly to what are some of the challenges he faced? What are some of the crises that he faced that were setbacks? Because I think they speak to us. And I think we can learn from kind of the sweep of his life and what he faced, but then how did he face it? What was the dynamics? And so I want to look at the profound challenges that marked his life. And the first of those is that he was cut off from his own family. You might recall, and I'll just surmise the background, that Joseph had gotten sold into slavery. We'll look at his life next week. But when he got sold into slavery, eventually he ends up in Egypt, and he's so gifted at kind of managing affairs, and he's so profound, and God's kind of given him this anointing, so that he rises up. And he's actually now one of the kind of rulers, and so his own people, the Israelites, are invited to come during a time of famine, and they're provided for, and so it's all friendly until the fact is that the Pharaoh, in this largest of empires in the world at the time, the Pharaoh said, this is not so good. And it had been so long now that he doesn't remember what Joseph did for the people, so he doesn't really care about that favor to these Israelites. What he sees is merely a threat. He sees the Israelites as becoming so numerous, they were probably numbering close to 2 million, that they just deemed to be a threat against it. So he begins to shift gears and begins to bring the people under greater oppression. And so now they become oppressed and enslaved. And then it grows worse and worse until he wants to really wipe out or reduce the power of the Israelites who are now in Egypt. And so he calls for all the midwives to go, Egyptian midwives, to kill the children when they're born. And they refuse, and so he goes to the people and says publicly, destroy the infants of the Israelites. And so you have this dramatic and horrific moment. And it's at that moment that Moses' mother, and you maybe remember the story, realizes that she needs to save him by sending him away in some form or fashion. And so she sends him down that river. And we read this in Acts 7, which surmises it. It says, at that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house, for 3 months. But then when he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him in and brought him up as her own. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action. You may recall the story that the mother places him in some kind of reed-made basket that would float, and she sends him down the large but slow-moving Nile River, and there, bathing down the way, was, among others, Pharaoh's daughter, who finds him and takes him in and really adopts him as a gift to her and raises him in the home of Pharaoh. And we see this as in all of the beauty of it. We think, wow, we see God is able to bring forth such great potential out of this. And we just think what a marvelous gift it was to Moses that he somehow was, found by Pharaoh's daughter and picked up. And that may all be true. But I wonder if for Moses, do you really think that for him, somehow being abandoned by his own family, his own roots, was a good thing? I don't think so. I don't think he went to Pharaoh's daughter, his adopted mother, and said, oh, tell me the story again where you found me abandoned and floating down a river. I don't think that's a story he wanted to hear very often, because somewhere in that there's a deep pain. The pain of what happened, the pain of being cut off from one's whole roots and identity. He knows he's not an Egyptian. That kind of emerges clear at some point. So who am I, and why was I cut off from the very source? I mean, it's one thing to be raised and have these privileges, but am I wanted? Was I loved? What was my own roots? I think it says it so dynamically when it summarizes in that place where it says he was placed outside. And I think forever he carries this wound in him that he is one who's been placed outside of belonging to a people. And not many of us here will ever feel that we were sent down the river. Maybe to some degree you might feel that, but somehow at some level we all can feel ourselves to be separated from the very root of our being. Separated perhaps from family who mediate God as the source of life, and ultimately though of God. And we can feel ourselves feeling separation at a deep level. And he carries this profoundly as a wound in his life. And what do you do when you feel cut off from that? When you don't have a sense that you're valued just because, like little Luke, that you're just born and loved and you belong. Well, what you try to do is you try to earn it. You try to earn that acceptance and say, I'll prove that I belong to a people. And so that's where we see the story take up. And Moses, though he had been raised in the royal family, though he had now become educated as part of the household of Pharaoh, and many believe that he was actually being raised up to be potentially the next Pharaoh. He could have been, depending on some circumstances. And so you're talking about a man who had the ultimate of ultimate in terms of education, wealth, power, everything. But he still had that wound. And so as the account goes on, and in verse 23 it says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Now Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them. This is his moment. This is it. I'm one of you guys. I'm back in the family. That's what he's probably thinking. But they did not. But they did not. That's a pretty powerful thing. 40 years he had waited to finally become one with them, and they didn't. The next day Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting, and they tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you're brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" Right? Family, brothers. He's emphasizing that. But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" They saw it was pretentious for Moses to step in now and claim to have some part with them. "Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" This has kind of come out. This is known. This is a bad situation, and they don't want me, and Pharaoh's going to find out, and this is tough. Moses at this very point seems to be saying, look, hey guys, I'm home, I'm one of you. And he's waiting for that big high five. He's waiting for them to turn around and go, dude, thank you. And they don't. What do? They say, get away from us. So now the second kind of challenge he feels, not only being cut off from his family and those roots, but now he's rejected by his own people. Now I know that rejection is a part of life, but I think it's a harder part of life than sometimes we even want to admit. I mean, one of the coolest things to say, is like, hey, I don't care what anybody thinks, right? Everybody says that. You have to kind of say it at some point. I don't care what anybody thinks. Anyone who says that cares a lot what people think, okay? We all care what people think. It's a natural part to want to have a sense that I belong, that I fit. And the truth is, we can kind of have, well, I'm socially independent. I wear a different color shoes than everybody else. Something, we find that. Or we get a nice religious script, and so we kind of, I'll become the prophet. I'll be the one who tells everyone, what God's really doing and that they need to change, and that way they'll reject me. But it's not because of me, it's because of God. I see that lived out too often. And we don't know what to do with rejection, so we've tried to find other reasons for it. The truth is sometimes we're just obnoxious jerks, and the truth is there's sometimes just reasons. There's lots of reasons, but we don't know what to do with it. And the truth is it is painful to be rejected, especially if it is about trying to stand with that which is right, where we're trying to find our true home. And so we find him going through this process, and then we read in the text, it says it was by faith that Moses then left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. And it could be referring later to the Exodus or to this point where the text says he fled off to Midian. Midian is out in the wilderness. He goes off into the wilderness. And outside of the city there that they're in, there's nothing there. But there were no other major towns or cities. He is going off into the desert where there's nothing but nomadic people, not even really towns like we would think of as a town. And there he goes off, and we might think, well, of course, what else could he do? Well, he could have done something. He probably could have gone to Pharaoh, and considering that he's royalty, they had rights to oppress anybody, and certainly commoners. Probably the Egyptian he killed was a guard, and he probably could have said, hey, Dad, I lost my temper, and his dad would have said, what, okay, don't do it again. He probably would have been accepted. It wouldn't have necessarily been big. But he was in this division going on between whether he was going to be an Israelite and stand with the people of God as he understood they had been called, or he was going to take all the goodness of Egypt. And this is what's so profound, is at this point, he's like, well, I'm rejected by these people, but I'm not going back. I'm not going to go back and try to just sell myself again to being Pharaoh's daughter. And that's a profound choice he made. Even though he's not going to be embraced by the Israelites, so he goes off. And he goes off, and in the text in Genesis it says, and it just goes out, it says he found a well and he sat down. And you can imagine him in that moment, just getting to the place where he just sits down after everything that's happened, 40 years, and he comes out, and now he's sitting there, and what? He's facing dependency. I don't know anybody. How am I going to live out here? And obscurity. Nobody knows who I am. And in some ways, that's a profound part of his life and a profound part of our lives. I think we all have to face at some level what needs to happen when we find that we move into a season in which we have a new life that is dependent and in a sense, obscure. you can see the human ego has to kind of, at that moment as he's out there, it has to face the fact that, I have tried to make myself like God, and I'm not God. And I'm really not all powerful, and I'm not a superhero, and superheroes, I'm sorry, but they're not real. Don't flip out, but they reflect something of the fact that they reflect ideals, but we're not that, and we're not, and so we kind of dream our way into that. And somewhere we have to face this fact that I'm not all that I want to be and believe and bigger than life, and so we kind of are trying to ward off despair on one hand and despondency, I don't know what to do with that. So we become dreamers, and we kind of get on the sidelines, and I'll just dream about it. We get caught in this place and so he's grounded. At this point, sitting at that well, his life gets grounded, and it gets quite grounded, because a woman comes up to him and kind of helps him out. You ain't from around here, are you? You can just imagine her, who are you? And part of the nomadic people, her name's, and she takes him to her father, and his father kind of takes him in. You look like you need help. He teaches him how to raise sheep, Now just think about that for a minute. This guy has been raised to rule the Egyptian empire, to rule much of the known world. And now he just has sheep who he hopes follow him. That's it. That will ground you. That will bring you to a profound humility. And you know what? Sometimes we need that season in the wilderness. We need it now. Also, the father gives his daughter Zipporah to marry. So you have Mo and Zippy, and they have this nice little life out in the desert with some sheep. And they have a couple children, and so that'll ground you too. There's nothing like a spouse to ground you in who you really are. And there's nothing like children to ground you because you wipe poopy diapers instead of, ruling the world. And so you've got this profound sense in which his life gets grounded. He has to work through that he is not God, and he's not going to rule the world and people. And in that humility, I think God uses. It's as if God used the time in Egypt being raised in royalty to give him great skills in leadership and military strategy and management of people, and highly educated. He used that, but he now had to take away that impulsiveness that says, I'm going to go and strike and do it my way. And now he's humbled. And out of that profound humility, he goes forward. But you understand that's hard. Maybe you've been through a time where you thought, I had great dreams. Man, then I had to go through a season where it was all taken away. And there was a little part of you that said, this is horrible, but then you also thought, but maybe it's healthy. Maybe there's something about losing that, because you know what? It was kind of presumptuous. It was kind of false and fake anyways. And maybe I don't have to sell myself out to something that's so fragile. Maybe I become more durable. Maybe I become more durable when I go through that season and realize it's not about claiming those things. And so he goes through that. He's not connected. And now God's prepared to draw that together, and God comes calling. And so we read in this last section of Acts 7, it says, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. Now, you might remember we're told the bush was burning but not burning up. There was something unique taking place. As he went over to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice. And we don't know how he heard this. It was audibly outside of himself or within himself, but he hears God, whom he had not probably heard the voice of as we often think the Spirit does to us. This is probably quite a profound experience. And he hears the Lord's voice saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's his roots, what he's always longed for. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. Not your people, my people. They are mine. There's a bigger story you're a part of. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. Whoop. you can catch Moses at this point. Go, wait, excuse me? About that last part? Yeah, you might think, now we might read the story and go, wow, his time's come. He's been waiting, and this is his chance to go back to Egypt, man. You think so? I don't think so. I don't think he was going, this is great news. In fact, it becomes very clear he's not excited about this calling. He's profoundly affected by God meeting him. And he grasps the sacredness of this. And he has a deep sense of honor for God above all. But he does not know, he does not know how to reconcile who he is with this calling to go back and lead the people out. These 2 million, are you kidding? Because what was that representing for him? It represented going back and facing all of the oppression, opposition, and rejection he had ever known. It's all there, back there. If he goes back, what does he face? Pharaoh, in all of his wrath against him for being an unfaithful son, so to speak, or grandson, this unfaithful family leader that was being raised up, oh my gosh, the oppression is going to come down hard. Not to mention, he understands exactly how much Pharaoh sees the people as a threat. And anybody who tries to bring them freedom and the economic cost of that, oh my gosh, the opposition will be great. Oh, but at least I'll have the Egyptians, right? The ones who told me to get out of there. The ones who told me they wanted nothing to do with me. The ones who resented my stepping out at all. So I get to lead a people who will reject me and ridicule me against the greatest power on earth almost at the time in terms of the seat of the Pharaoh. That does not sound really exciting. So he begins to, as you may recall in the story, he begins to, give reasons. Hey, no offense, God, but I stutter, I won't be very good at leading people, He comes up with these reasons, and God keeps saying, I'll provide for that. And finally, at some point, he reaches that place in which he accepts and goes what? Forward. This is the moment where he could have so said, I'm done. I don't want any more pain. My life is deeply wounded. And some of us in this room say, my life's so wounded, I'm just trying to survive. How do you survive? By just laying low, just trying to avoid any kind of means to new rejection or new opposition. And that's where some of us get to. The truth is, in this room right now, our lives are far more defined than they should be by just avoiding opposition. And he had every reason. It's a dynamic point. But he steps out. He steps out. And it's profound that he does. And so the fourth stage here that you see is that he's called out to lead against opposition and rejection. And the truth is, you could summarize the life of Moses this way. Moses spent 40 years trying to be somebody. Then he spent 40 years if you caught that in the desert, learning to be nobody. And then he spent 40 years learning what God can do with nobody. And that is a good summation of something that you and I, that might give us perspective on our lives. We tend to start off life saying, I want to be somebody, I want to make my mark, I want to somehow prove that I'm valuable, or that I matter, that I have significance. And at some point, we have to reconcile with the fact that we need to be grounded in the fact that we're not God, and reconcile with that, and realize that we have so much if we just embrace what we do have, which is not to be God, but to be those who bear His image. And we have to go through that time of wilderness and humility, and finally become okay with who we are. And then we can find out what God is able to do, where He takes the gifts we do have and He works with them. And that's kind of something for all of us to learn. I've seen this through midlife crisis. It used to be referred to as midlife crisis back when, particularly men in America were raised to say, if you're a responsible person, you're going to go out there, have a job, raise a family, and there's a great payoff. Except by about the age of 45 or 50, there was what? No great payoff. Your teenagers didn't give a rip about you. Your company wasn't exactly going to give you, significance in the world. And so men were just like, what do I do now? Run off and find a younger woman, go try to buy a sports car. I mean, what? There's this emptiness. And what I find is that people aren't waiting to buy into that American false dream. They're asking that question earlier. There's this underlying crisis that says, What's it all for? Who am I in the midst of this? And so you see at this critical point that Moses emerges able to fulfill, as we all need to, what he has for his life. And how does he do that? Let me close with these 3 things that stand out to me as what we see said about his faith to be one who kept going forward. The first of those is how he assessed deeply what will last. Verse 26 says, he thought it better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. He looked at the treasures of Egypt. I mean, he knew them well. And usually sometimes people who have them aren't trying, to invest their whole being to figure out how to get that new, version of the new thing or whatever. You have it and you realize it's kind of empty. So he knew well what Egypt held. And he knew that there was something about it that wasn't lasting. It kind of had a nice facade for everyone to look at, but behind the scenes, it was empty. There wasn't really anything there. When the royalty and the Pharaoh and his family died, they died. They didn't look any different than any other decomposing body. Like, what is it that's here? So he sees that and he looks and he thinks deeply, what is lasting? And he decides, none of that will really fulfill me. I'd rather live knowing I've been faithful to God. I care more about what's within me and whom I'm becoming than what I have. And that's a transition some of us have felt in our own lives, where you begin to start grasping what really matters, what will last. And he decides, I'm holding on to whom I'm becoming to be a faithful person with God. And by the way, we all do well. The newest iPhone, it will not change your life. I'm not trying to take anything away from it, but we all start to learn as we go through life. You know what? It didn't really make my life really different. I mean, after a couple months, the couple things, they're just, we start getting more perspective. Well, he has that, and we do well. Our problem is that we don't just make the wrong choice. We don't even think we have a choice. We are sometimes so immersed in the culture that we're raised in and what we're thinking about, what we have. We don't even realize we think we have to live in Egypt. See, Moses knew, I don't have to live in Egypt. And some of us get so familiar with Egypt, we just think that that's all there is. We really think that, you know what, I want to be the Pharaoh's daughter. I don't have a choice in the matter. Yes, you do. He realized, I do not have to identify with being her daughter. Now, it wasn't against her. It was meaning against the Pharaoh. She may have been good and served his life well, but I am not, he is saying, I am not going to carry that identity. It's not worth it. And some of us in this room right now might need to say, you know what? I don't know that I've really chosen to assess. I think I'm working so hard to be Pharaoh's daughter, or whatever that represents for you in your identity, or to have this wealth and these things, and to be in this culture. Have you ever realized you can actually denounce this culture as being what defines you? It's not easy, though. We do it at a very shallow level, I'm my own person. What does that mean? To really be your own, to really root yourself more deeply in God, it's a deeper question. It really means saying no to the culture and having to chase it all. So he assesses deeply. And here's what he knew. He knew this. He knew that, as to quote another, that you are only as durable as the thing you love most. You're not going to have staying power. You're not going to have strength to stand in this world unless the thing that you love most is itself durable and lasting. If I love something most that can never pass away, I'll never pass away. If I can love something most that will last forever, I will last forever. But if I love anything that's vulnerable, then I'm vulnerable. If what I love most, if what I'm attached to most is itself finite and fragile, well then what happens? I'm always feeling its finiteness, its fragileness. I'm always feeling that it might change its mind, that it might change its character, that it might not give me the payoff, that it might change what matters. And I don't know if I'm ever going to feel that love. Thomas Oden wrote, he taught at Drew University, and he taught on developmental philosophy, and he talked about how we are always have goals. Every human life sets goals that internally it has to realize it's competing goals because it has to choose what's on top. It has to choose what's defining. It has to choose what's centered. That everything else has to come around. And he says this, if you choose a finite center of value, that is that what's most central to you is finite, limited, you're always anxious. He says, anxiety becomes neurotically intensified to the degree that I have idolized finite values. And what he means by that is if you make the most important center of your life to what your parents think, what somebody else thinks of you, what your boss thinks, how well you succeed, then you are going to spend your whole life anxiously relating to the fact that that's fragile. And you can never really be at peace because the very thing you've given yourself to is itself never at peace, never settled. It is finite. It will itself end, and it will change, and it will be malleable, and you will never be durable. And so the only source by which you and I can become durable is when we make that which is infinite, that is God, the center of our being. And when I say, you know what, God be the center, I want everything else to revolve around you, then guess what? We have something unchanging. We have a love that's unchanging. We have a force that's unchanging. We have that which is holding the whole universe together in profound and mysterious ways that we don't even begin to understand. That is the center. And Moses learned how to assess these things. Secondly, we learn from him to embrace suffering that is involved in doing right. We think, embrace suffering? I don't want to embrace suffering. Suffering's not a good thing. It doesn't say, we're never told that Moses sought suffering. We shouldn't seek to suffer. That is a neurotic thing. That's kind of dysfunctional if we seek to suffer. But life, if we're going to be faithful to a center, is going to involve sometimes suffering for what is right. We read in verse 25 that he chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. And so it is here that he understands that it's most important to do what is right even when it doesn't fit, even when that might bring hardships. And he embraces that as part of life. The alternative, the place that so often we come to, is that we just think, you know what, the one thing I want, my highest value is that life would be easy. If you make that your highest value, then you're kind of by default going to go the path of least resistance. Well, I don't know, wherever there's no opposition or rejection, and we're just so avoiding it, we can't be durable. We're kind of all over the place. But he accepts that sometimes it's so important to stand for what is true and right and unchanging, then let the suffering come with it. I'd rather not give that up for the sake of just because it's not easy. And so he embraces and chooses to identify with God's people. And even though the king's wrath, even though he loses all the wealth, he makes that choice. And I'm sure he's probably saying, I don't get it. Like, why is this, if you're in this, why is all this coming? Why is it so hard? Why are we suffering so much? Why don't you make this simpler? The truth is, we don't always get what we're going through. We don't. But Moses had a way of just holding on, not because it was easy, but because he just knew it was the right thing. The truth is, at some point, you and I have to come to a place where we hold on to what we do understand when there's things we don't understand. In other words, there's always stuff you and I don't understand. I don't understand why this is happening or that's understanding. And I want to wait and understand it. So what do I hold on to? How do I hold on to what I do understand. Moses knew that God had worked in his life. You know that God at some point has worked in your life. You don't understand how. You're not clear on a lot of things, but God's worked and you hold on to that. And what you find, as Moses did, is that ultimately he begins to see that who is it that drowns? The Egyptians, not his people. Who is it that moves into the land? His people. God is ultimately the one that is going to work beyond even the oppression of a season. And so he begins to gain that. And thirdly, and lastly, we see in his life that he sees that which is invisible. He sees the invisible in some way. in verse 27 it says he kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. As the psalmist writes, Psalm 16, I have set the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. There's a connection here. You can't really just figure life out and make good assessments. You can't kind of do it all in your head. At some point, I need some of my mind, my heart, and my spirit to be connecting with God. It doesn't mean I get it all, but I have enough connection, enough rootedness that my mind stays on God, focused on Him, thinking about Him, opening my heart to Him, letting me feel God's love, and keeping that connection alive so that I'm able to stay in that place and connect and hold that durability, have the ability to hyperstand, if you will, through life. And we see this in Moses' life. It's very clear he did not know how to keep going forward. He didn't have answers, but he kept going at every step, every stage. And the question for us is, are we able to be those then who are durable? Do you want that durable life? Do you want that power to stand? We see is that Moses had the power to realize that at some level you have to come to this deep internal choice. This place in which you settle some things out of which you can keep going. And you don't feel, you kind of move past the inner conflict. And so we see this in his life, and it beckons us, it calls out to us today. We see in him that he refused Egypt's fame. That it says that he decided, like, I don't want to be Pharaoh's daughter. And again, he wasn't speaking of her and what she did. Good for him. There's many things that are good. But he's saying, I don't want that identity. I don't want what comes with it. I'm not going to chase that false identity. Do you understand the power that comes when you say, I don't care what this world really thinks of me, and you don't mean it in some nice social fashion, but in a deeply personal fashion? When you have the power inside to say, you know what? God, I care more about what you think than whether I'm popular or whether I have fame. Do you understand how that makes you incredibly powerful when you don't need some other identity? But you sing in your soul, as we sang earlier in song, I am a child of God. It settles a lot. It makes you very powerful. And he gave up, it says, and he refused the wealth of the world. And he really realized it's not really about what I have. I'm not going to spend my life just trying to gain. I mean, I want to do good things, but I am not going to become what I have. Do you realize how powerful you are? How powerful you become when you realize that I am not what I have. I'm not what I wear. For some of us, that's really good. But it's powerful when you kind of find this ability to realize that I'm kind of have a certain freedom from that. You become far more powerful because you're not under the power of everything telling you what you need and what you have and what you have to be and what you surround yourself with. There is power in that. And so it is that he resigned himself from these things, and he renounced Egypt's king. And he said, I don't care about his anger. I'm not living my life out to the anger of the one who I think can hurt me. I don't care. I'm going to follow what God has for me. Do you understand how powerful that is? And when you say, I don't care, I'm not going to be afraid of someone's rejection or opposition, do you realize? And some of us need to come to that deep place. And even here it says that, and he continued to understand the Passover, and that God's the one who provides the blood, not the religion of his culture. And he refused that religion of his culture and all of its games, and he says, no, I'm banking on the one who's provided the blood, and that is God, who provided it for the Passover, with the Passover lambs to escape Egypt, and ultimately in Christ. And he says, in him, that's where I bank it. And I don't care what ideas this world has about what I need to do to find religious success. No, I'm banking on what God's done. There's power in that. Would you pray with me? And let's just open our hearts to to how God might want to lead us forward. God, we're reminded so profoundly today that our lives began, and we didn't feel probably a lot of setbacks so early. We felt cheered on, perhaps, the world wide open, but we have faced things. Some of us have felt separation. Some of us have felt out of that separation that we've been trying to exert our own wills, trying to prove ourselves. Some of us know that we've needed or have had, or we want you to finish that work in the wilderness where you just ground us and help us to become free. That we might declare that now deep in our own hearts, that we don't need to be Pharaoh's daughter. We don't need to identify with that which somehow is going to validate us or give us fame. We want to be your children. And we give you thanks for the life of Moses and how it just beckons us to stand on those shoulders, to follow in the power to go forward. And we thank you that ultimately it's in Christ that you told us that ultimately He is the one who endured for the sake of the cross. He is the one who came down from royalty. Jesus, thank you that you left the royalty of heaven and you came into our world, that you identify with us in our oppression. We thank you that you are the one who not only parted the Red Sea towards life in a promised land, but you parted the way of death. You defeated death. And when the enemy tried to come after us to destroy us, you defeated death and you've led us into the way of life. We give you thanks that you are the one who redeems us. You are the one who leads us towards that promised land. We follow in your ways, and we pray that even as we've been called, that we would look to you, Jesus, as the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before you, for what you saw, you endured the cross and so much more. And you went forward. Give us the power now to go forward, to let faith arise in us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.